We ready, Sam?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Would you like to call the roll?
Let me turn the audio off on the YouTube so I don't get feedback, and then yes, I will. All right. All right, I'll start with Richard Keebler.
Here.
Carla Blackmore.
Here.
And Corey Watt, not here. Shauna Rosenberg.
Here.
Jason Bracken.
Here.
Richard Daniels.
Here.
And William Snavely. Sorry, I messed up your name there. Bill Snavely.
I'm here. All
I
right.
usually say William.
Yeah, thank you. So the first item ahead of us is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Daniel, seconded by Carla Blackmore. Sorry. We're having a rash of that tonight. All those in favor of approving the agenda indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Who said they were opposed? Oh, it was just a late. Okay. So next item is approval of the minutes of May 12th, 2020. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Rich Daniels, seconded. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, raise your hand, please. Okay, thank you. The minutes are approved. Next item is public comments related to items not on the agenda. So if anybody is watching this and connected and you would like to comment, we'll let Sam identify if anyone would like to comment. And these are items not on the agenda.
Mr. Chair, I'm looking and I don't have any registered attendees other than
Okay.
everyone you already see on the screen.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Therefore, we will move to reports from commissions, boards, committees, and staff, and I'll begin with the staff. Sam?
I'm going to let Zach take that tonight because he recently attended the OKI meeting. Thank you.
Welcome, Zach.
Sorry for the delay there. Just wanted to unmute my microphone so everyone would hear me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick update for the commission tonight. So this morning I attended a meeting of the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Regional Council of Governments Intermodal Coordinating Committee. And the information that they conveyed at that meeting relates to a recent funding application from the city for a future segment of the Oats Trail. This would be a segment between more or less between the Talawanda High School and the Talawanda Middle School, so on the south side of the city. What they gave us at the meeting, they gave us information on the applications that had been received from the various jurisdictions, applicants throughout the region that are applying for federal funding. The city had applied for what is known as STBG funds for the state of Ohio. And there's $29 million available for this funding cycle. And there was $48 million requested from various applications, including our own. I believe our application was for around $3 million to go toward a future Oats segment. So we will find out then in October what the recommendation is from their, I believe it's called their prioritization subcommittee that first makes a recommendation on which projects should get funded. So that will come back to the ICC, the Intermodal Coordinating Committee, in October for yet another recommendation, and then that goes to the full OKI board for approval. So just wanted to update everybody on the status of that application. And that's all I have to share.
Thank you. Any other staff comments? Seeing none, we'll start with Richard. If you have any comments on CIC.
Just that we've, I think, given away most of the first 200,000. I forget now. Carla, are you on the CIC too? Okay, I thought, because somebody from planning will have to get assigned to the CIC. That's
We'll
kind
do
of
that at our next meeting.
And I think there are about 6 applications for loans under the revised loan program that the city council approved a meeting or two ago for, I think, $10,000 loans. And there were, at that time, there were 6 applicants. It's been a week and a half, 2 weeks at least. So there may be a few more. So that program, I mean, the money's giving away money, I guess, is pretty easy. So a lot of people took some. Now, how much they'll be able to pay back, and of course, indirectly in the sense of the sale of the gift cards and that sort of thing. A lot of changes were made with the gift cards to make it more flexible, easier to manage and that sort of thing. So that's been the major issue for CIC for the last 6 weeks or so.
Okay, thank you. Would any other members like to make a report? Okay, Carla.
Yeah, so we had our Oxford Parking and Transportation Advisory Board meeting yesterday, and we were discussing the plans for the repavement of Chestnut. And I think that there's this hope that as we do repaving as part of our city work in the summer, going forward, that we will use that opportunity to try to ensure that our corridors become complete streets now that we have a complete streets policy in place. We're in a difficult situation in this calendar year where the complete streets policy was recently passed. And so the process for providing input about how paving should be done to advance complete streets is lagging a little bit behind, I think, where we would ideally like it to be in order to ensure that we're building those complete streets. In the future, we hope to provide input sooner. In the case of Chestnut, I think what we're trying to figure out is what the alignment of the striping should be so that hopefully going forward, as there are improvements to the street, that we won't have to grind all of the rather expensive, I think it's like special plastic fusion lines up when new improvements are made. And so there's been some sort of tricky discussions about how that will look. And I think one of the positive things that we came to through that meeting is that we can put some temporary center lines in before we go to the more expensive lining of that street, so that we can kind of work through some of those details about what that alignment should be to make it a more complete street. But I think we're experiencing with Chestnut what we have going on with many of our primary corridors in town, which is that they're pretty narrow. There's not a lot of wiggle room to realize that vision of a complete street, and there's a lot of trade-offs to be made. And so those include trading off street parking on some of these major corridors. So that's something, at the end of the day, we came up with some recommendations, including looking at getting rid of parking on Chestnut in the area that will be repaved, and those recommendations will be coming to council. So it's definitely been interesting to think about the many different competing demands on some of these corridors. And Chestnut is just a very fast-moving street with, that will hopefully ultimately house, our Amtrak station on the south side of it. So making sure that it is a complete street is really important. At the same time, it's just a narrow corridor. So it's been very interesting to be in those discussions. And I think that the good news is that the temporary striping will potentially buy us some time as we figure out how to make that street work better.
Okay, thank you. I think, Jason, I saw your hand.
Yeah, Environmental Commission met recently, and we mostly discussed the greenhouse gas inventory summary that our helpers in the Institute of Environmental Science put together for us, and it was fantastic. And we talked about that a bit and how to go forward, because that greenhouse gas inventory is only City of Oxford governmental greenhouse gas, but we need to do a community-wide going forward. And so we're talking how the city is going to work with the public service projects with IES again going forward, and the extent of that and all the intricacies and details. But it looks like we're going to have a good partnership, hopefully going forward, and doing a lot of work there.
Okay,
And that's all I have for environmental.
okay, thank you. Shauna, do you have?
Yeah, so Housing Advisory Commission, we had our meeting a week after our last Planning Commission meeting, and I had presented on some research I did for incentives that the city might be able to provide to developers to encourage them to build affordable housing into their developments. So I made that initial presentation, and then Zach has created an amazing kind of slide presentation that we can talk about at our next meeting to kind of go through which things we think would be more successful than others.
Okay, great. Have I missed anybody? Seeing none, we'll move to new business, which is a staff presentation on transient guest lodging, AKA short-term rentals. So I will turn that over to Zach or Sam, whoever would like to lead us off.
And Sam, I think you need to make me the host now, so that way I can share my slideshow with everyone. So if you want to pass the baton over to me, that'd be great. All right, thank you. Okay. All right, can everyone see my cover slide? Transient guest lodging?
Yep.
Thumbs up, great. I will just keep it on this view. That way you can keep track of the slide numbers up here. So if we ever need to revisit a certain slide, you can just give me the number. It's been a while since we've talked about what we were deeming at the time as short-term rentals. We wish to use a new term now, which is transient guest lodging. That is recommended to us by our law director, Mr. Chris Connard, just to make sure that that is clearly separate and distinct from our regular rentals, what we would call currently our long-term rentals, which are, sort of the, conventional, either rented out to families or to students. So that is, currently the way we divide it out is short-term and long-term. So moving forward, we're looking to use this different terminology to make sure that there is a clear distinction between the two. I also want to mention, we have a few folks joining us on the call today. Dr. Mark Tremblay from the Farmer School of Business at Miami University is joining us. We really want to thank him and his students, Ben and Jordan. They put in a tremendous amount of work studying data on short-term rentals here in Oxford. This slide is just a sliver of some of the findings that they were able to uncover about rentals here in Oxford that are rented short-term or transient guest lodging establishments that we have. So I wanted to present some key takeaways for everyone, just to kind of present the current picture, if you will, of transient guest lodging here in the city of Oxford. What they looked at was called AirDNA data, which looks at transaction data whenever there is a rental that is rented either through Airbnb or through HomeAway, which I believe VRBO or Verbo is a part of. So they looked at that data and they found that there were 122 unique listings that were inside of the Oxford city limits. And most of these, to our surprise, were actually outside of the mile square, not as many inside the mile square. There were actually a little bit more listings when you look around Oxford. That basically encapsulates the Oxford market area, which extends out into the townships. And there's 148 unique listings when you include that area as well. There's also 24 property owners with multiple listings in and around Oxford. So they have multiple units that they rent out short term. That's what that means. The average nightly asking price and monthly revenue in 2019 was $336 a night, with a total of around $3,800 a month. And the total revenue that has been accumulated by all rentals since 2014 is roughly 6.8 million. So as you can see, this is a very lucrative sort of business for a lot of people, and it brings in a lot of revenue. We also looked at the times when there was peak occupancy, and those tend to be during the move-in and move-out weekends that are associated with Miami University's academic calendar. And the occupancy would actually reach around up to 65% total occupancy. So what that means is 65% of the units that were quote unquote active listings were occupied during these peak periods. So that's what that means. And then the last 3 bullet points were especially useful in creating sort of a initial proposal, if you will, of where we'd like to head with legislation on the topic of transient guest lodging. So the first bullet point there, the 32% of rentals, so roughly a third of all rentals are actually booked less than 30 total days out of the year. So less than 1 month's time span cumulatively out of an entire year. A third of all rentals are booked for that amount of time. You add another third to that roughly, so 64%. Those are booked less than 100 days a year, which is a little bit over 3 months' time. So 2/3 of all the rentals are booked around 3 months out of the year or less, is what that means. And then a fifth of the rentals are booked greater than 150 days. And we find these, we would pretty much characterize these as more of a business model sort of unit. So one where there tends to be the primary occupant is mostly absent from the property or is absent for a larger period of time and is renting that more like a hotel room would be rented more consistently. So we were able to find that roughly a fifth of the rentals fit that category. So as I said, the translation that we'd like to move toward is transient guest lodging. So that is essentially going to equal what we were previously discussing with the commission as short-term rentals. And we would like to define this as a dwelling unit or portion thereof, where sleeping accommodations are offered for consideration to persons occupying a room or rooms for less than X consecutive days duration, where we would fill in X with a number. And X could be any number, and in Oxford is actually currently 14. So if you're renting for less than 14 days, so in other words, 13 or less, then you are considered a short-term rental establishment, and that's per our business code. But we are finding in our research that most communities will set this number anywhere between 29 to 31. So what they're really making the distinction on is a unit that is rented month to month or even 1 month at a time. That's more of a normal rental situation. Whereas if you're renting it for less than 30 consecutive days, that tends to be your transient guest type of situation. So for that matter, we recommend adjusting it to 30. So for the rest of this presentation, we just like to continue with the premise that if everyone is comfortable with 30, that we would adjust it to that. So then ultimately this leads to the key question, which is how would we treat dwelling units differently based on the number of days that they are being rented on a consecutive basis? So the 2 different categories would be the dwelling units that are rented less than 30 days, consecutive days, versus those that are rented 30 or greater consecutive days. And just to clarify, so our rental permit program that really has its roots in our property maintenance code primarily currently makes no distinction on this. It applies equally to all the units, no matter the lease term. So this would take amending the property maintenance code in order to draw that distinction. So for comparison, let's agree that the dwelling units rented 30 or greater consecutive days we should just continue treating those the exact same that we have been. We would call these our long-term rentals. And all of the current provisions would continue to apply. So really, the only category that we would need to focus on, our exercise, if you will, becomes comparing the provisions currently in place to those that we might then propose to adopt for less than 30 consecutive days. So then looking at the two categories, so up above the stay length is the distinction that I just drew. So the first column is the 30 days or greater, and these are our current provisions that affect all rentals. And then less than 30 days are essentially staff's initial proposal for provisions for transient guest lodging establishments as we would define it. So going to the first category or standard, I guess you would call it, the number of days annually. So there's really no need to limit that for a long-term rental situation because it can just go, they can have the lease period be for a semester or for a whole year or, calendar year or whatever it is. There's really not a reason for us to place a limit on that. But where it would come into play would be more so with the transient guest lodging establishments. And for that, we are actually proposing 90 days be the maximum, so 3 months time. So if you remember back to the data slide from Dr. Tremblay's research, that would effectively cover around 2/3 of all rentals would basically be allowed under this proposed set of regulations. That's kind of where that 90-day figure comes in. There are other communities that have set it at 90. So we do see some precedent in other communities for that. But we're also looking to the data to help inform the provisions as well. So the next category there is the principal use. So what we see transient guest lodging as is not necessarily a use, but it's the way in which the property is rented out. So currently, the way we would classify principal use for our long-term rentals is you either got a single family, you got a 2-family, a 3-family, multifamily, et cetera. Those are the principal uses. And then if somebody wants to rent that out as opposed to purchasing it and making it their primary residence, then you would simply apply for your rental permit and be subject to the restrictions with that permit. So the idea here is that the transient guest lodging use would really be accessory to the principal use of property. So the principal uses would remain the same, single family, 2-family, 3-family, but we would limit it to just that. So you could not have, for instance, a transient guest lodging establishment in an apartment building that had more than 3 units. And we would further limit it to no more than 1 per building. So if you had a duplex, you could only rent out one of the units as transient guest lodging. Say the other unit is the primary occupant. They can then, if they own the other unit that's attached to them, they can have their short-term rental out of that. And I see a hand from Bill. Bill, did you have a question?
Just a comment. So because we are saying that only up to a triplex is because if you have a larger building, you're really a little hotel.
Exactly.
Isn't that pretty much the case?
That is definitely the intent behind this proposed standard. It would prevent sort of the hotelization of a multifamily property from turning into a hotel establishment. The idea is if you're going to have a hotel and you're going to use Airbnb or HomeAway or whatever platform to rent out those units, then from a zoning perspective, you should really come forward for what I think in most cases would be a conditional use under a commercial zoning district. So if you're talking about a residential area, that would really involve having to do a rezoning to commercial in order to achieve that. So just continuing on with the table, number of contracts. So don't let this confuse you. Basically what this is talking about, so for a long-term rental situation, you have a lease contract, whereas for transient guest lodging, Airbnb, you have a booking. I mean, it's basically the same deal. You're reserving the room, you're, signing saying, I'm going to rent out this room. So that's what that's talking about with a number of contracts. So for the long-term rentals, we wouldn't have a limit on these because, as you know, there are many student rentals here in town, and there can be multiple lease contracts for one unit. Say you have a 4-bedroom unit and it's rented, each bedroom is rented to a student. Each student has their own separate contract with the landlord. So we wouldn't have any restriction on that when it comes to the long-term rental situation. However, when it comes to transient guest lodging, and this is a provision we see in a lot of other communities as well, they limit it to no more than 1 contract per unit at a time. And what this prevents is a situation where you have strangers that are renting out the same unit at the same time. So you wouldn't have sort of a hostile type of situation arising as a result of that. There would only be one family or one group of people who know each other that make one booking, renting out a unit at a specific time. So that's what that one's all about. And then the idea is that all the other types of standards that would normally apply to the long-term rentals would apply just the same to the transient guest lodging. So the occupancy limits of our property maintenance code specifies you can't have more than, it's specified it's 1 occupant per 70 square feet of bedroom space. So let's say, for example, you had a bedroom 130 square feet in size, that would be limited to just 1 person because you don't have that second 70 square feet. You don't go up to 140 to allow for that second person. But if it was 150 square feet, it would allow for 2 under that limit. And then this is further limited by our zoning code definition of family, which specifies that you can have no more than 4 unrelated individuals in a dwelling unit. And of course, we have our neighborhood conservation overlay that even further restricts that down to 2 unrelated. And that, of course, is sort of a neighborhood initiated application where the neighborhood gets together and decides that they want to self-impose this restriction on them. With the parking, we would just apply that the exact same way. So 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit for single family, 2 family, and then 2.5 is what it is currently for a 3-family unit. So you need 2.5 times 3 to get the correct number of parking, which basically amounts to 8 parking spaces for a 3-family dwelling unit, because you would round up that number. The signage would apply just the same, having the building identification sign, having the temporary real estate sign, the same as any other dwelling in the city. And then we would require the exact same inspections that we would for long-term rentals. So this ensures that the safety aspects are taken care of, checking for things like fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, CO detectors, appropriate ingress and egress, those types of things that our inspectors are trained in would apply just the same to the short-term rentals as they would to the long-term. And then looking to the comparison with other communities. So we did take a look at quite a few communities, a lot of which are in Ohio. The same sort of discourse, the confusion about how to regulate these types of uses, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. This is something that we're finding repeats itself in multiple communities around us. But some of them have established regulations. Louisville is probably the closest to us and probably one of the earlier pioneers that created regulations and put regulations on the books for transient guest lodging, what they called short-term rentals. And there's been other communities in Ohio as well that have put regulations on the books that have been actually quite restrictive. But just to go down the list here, the examples. So in Ames, Iowa, their definition is 31 days or less. And they also set it at the 90 days cumulatively. So no more than 90 days in order to have your transient guest lodging use in a residential setting. With Dublin, Ohio, they did have some proposed legislation that was considered by their council, but then ultimately wasn't passed. It was referred back to committee. But they had a very similar definition for the TGLs, STRs, and they were actually going to set it at no more than 2 weeks' time out of the entire year. So they were going with a very restrictive sort of premise for their regulation, but ultimately that did not pass. With Louisville, Kentucky, their focus was not so much on the number of days, but rather the focus on the unit being the primary residence. And the reason that we would argue for the number of days over focus on primary residence is with primary residence, you really just have to have somebody probably sign something or you do something legal to say, this is going to be my primary residence. I'm not going to, it's not going to be a business type of property. So they tell you that one time, but then plans can change, situations can change. And you just sort of have to take their word for it. Whereas for the number of days for the restriction, that's something that if things do get out of hand, it gives you more of a concrete number to be able to, enforce these provisions. And it helps equip neighbors where if they start noticing that there's, ongoing activity throughout the year and it's, starting to surpass that 90-day limit, then it further helps equip us in terms of enforcing the overall picture of the regulations. So for those reasons, we would really recommend the ultimate limiting factor being the number of days as opposed to the restriction that it be just a primary residence. A couple communities sort of entering suburban areas like Oakwood and Upper Arlington, they have outright prohibited short-term rentals. You're not allowed to have a short-term rental at all, which basically means it's the same as saying you can't rent a unit for, in the case of Oakwood, you can't rent it for 25 days or less. In Upper Arlington, you can't rent it for 29 days or less. You can rent it for more days than that because magically in Oakwood, once you rent it for 26 days, then it's permitted. So that's kind of the distinction there. With Oxford, I've already mentioned it's 13 days or less is the current definition. We would propose 29 days or less just to keep it consistent with these other communities and then setting it at 90 days. And then Yellow Springs, which was actually an example given to us by our law director, and we actually borrowed their definition of transient guest lodging. With that example, they set it at 29 days. And I did not find a restriction on the cumulative number of days, but their way of sort of handling, keeping the reins on the approvals is to focus on the conditional use process. And with them being a smaller village and maybe not having as many rentals up front, maybe they were able to handle that in that manner. But what we want to try and do is reduce the administrative burden because we do have, we have those 122 units already that we know about. And we don't want to force all 122 of those to make a choice between doing a conditional use or shutting down. So we need to sort of find that balance between, allowing some of them and then maybe requiring that conditional use process for those that are more robust or more business oriented in nature. So just to go through our proposed amendments, this would affect 3 different codes under the city regulations. So beginning with the zoning code, so we would define the transient guest lodging as being less than the 30 days. As I said, we would limit it to no more than 1 per single family, 2-family, or 3-family building. No more than 1 booking at a time within that unit. No more than the 90 cumulative days out of the year. Basically with that, once somebody comes in, gets that rental permit, the idea is that number would actually appear on the permit itself. So currently there's another number that appears on that permit, and that's the maximum number of unrelated occupants in that unit. So the idea is that you would now have 2 numbers. You would have the maximum number of unrelated occupants and the maximum number of days that could be rented as a transient guest lodging type of use. Then we would further state to just offer as a relief valve, if you will, that any TGL that is booked more than the 90 days, the idea is then once you're renting it more than 3 months out of the year, it's starting to become more of a business sort of use. And normally when you've got business uses that are in a residential setting, a conditional use process where you notify everyone and you work out the details, you establish any conditions that should go with that use, that's a very appropriate process to have at that point. So if somebody wanted to do more than the 90 days, they would basically have to come in, make application, the same as they would do actually now under our current code as a bed and breakfast, which is a conditional use. And I think pretty much every residential district we have has it listed as conditional. So in essence, the policy would remain the same in that sense, that it would remain as a conditional use. If you're doing it more than 90 days, you've got to get that discretionary approval, and council ultimately has to approve that as a use specific to that property. And that'd be the time where you would consider the more disruptive impacts that would be felt by the neighborhood, consider the context. If it's a relatively isolated sort of property, then you may not need to hold it to as stringent conditions as you would if it was in a denser setting where you were going to affect more people. But those would be more appropriately held on a case-by-case sort of basis. I'm going to take a drink here real fast. The second code that would be affected would be the business code. And this is one that was actually amended last year to create our short-term rental registration program, because we really sold this as, before legislating these rentals, we needed to find out more about them. And now that we found out more about them through Dr. Trembley's research, now, this is sort of, bringing it back down. Okay, let's work out the details here. So that was a new chapter that was created, chapter 743 last year. So we would be amending that same chapter, replacing the terminology with TGLs, making sure that that definition matches, that it'd be set at less than 30 days as the way that we would define it. And then to further protect the neighborhood settings that may still be in compliance if it's less than 90 days, but if they are renting to particularly disruptive folks who are staying in those units and they are violating other city codes and disrupting the neighborhood, we would have an additional provision in here that the community development director, Sam, would be able to revoke registration if there are 2 or more civil and or criminal citations that are issued to that property owner. So there's an additional provision in there that helps kind of protect the impacts that might be felt that would be negative on a neighborhood where these short-term rentals would be taking place. And then finally, the property maintenance code that would need to be amended so that it applies equally to transient guest lodging as it would to long-term. So this would mean the rental permit would be required as it would for any other rental. That includes an annual renewal process that we already conduct for our rentals. Biennial inspections are required. So basically, once every 2 years, our inspector goes in. We offer 2 types of inspections. We offer a full inspection and exterior only. We strongly encourage the full inspection, but the exterior only, where it's essentially a drive-by of the property from the public street, we do offer that as an option. But most of our applicants for rental permits do choose the full inspection. That way they're meeting all their safety checks and keeping their tenants safe. Occupancy restrictions would apply the same. So the 4 unrelated, the 2 unrelated in the NCO districts, that would apply just the same. And all the safety provisions that I mentioned earlier, the smoke and CO detectors, ingress, egress, all of the safety aspects would be maintained with that as well. So that's essentially it. This is the last slide. This is kind of our, as I said, this is our initial proposal. So Sam, if you want to chime in at this point, you're more than welcome to, but I think what we're looking for is to get some feedback and hopefully the commission's blessing on this direction so that we can then share this with our transient guest lodging stakeholders in town to get their feedback, get some comments back from them, and then hopefully over the next couple of months, maybe by August, have something on the table for you to formally consider actually acting upon and ultimately bringing to council for approval. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions on any of the information I presented. I know it's a lot to consider and digest. Yep, I see a hand from Shauna.
I just want to first thank Mark and Jordan for their work. I think it's been very helpful, and it's good to have some solid data. So let's go to Shauna first then.
Okay, my first question is about 1 TGL per building. I know of several examples of current successful transient guest lodgings that use a building for like 2 or 3. Would that then be something they would need a conditional use to be allowed to do, or is the plan to completely remove that from the equation?
I think, and Sam, you are welcome to weigh in on this as well, but I think that certainly it could be up for debate as far as, what could trigger that conditional use process, just being able to take a closer look and have a closer eye on a certain situation that maybe doesn't strictly adhere to the, the by right provisions that we would establish. So maybe that applies, not only to the 90 days, but also to the other limiting factors like this limit of no more than 1 per building. Because really what we're trying to do is make sure that there isn't a commercial level of impact being felt in a residential setting. That is at the heart of all this. That is really the intent that we're going for. So with that, if the direction on that was more inclined toward, having more avenues toward that conditional use process, not necessarily the number of days, but also, the number of actual units within a building, we might be open to that, certainly. Sam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll chime in there too briefly as well. Thanks. I think that this is one of those balancing acts with the economic impact of what these provide for the community, with that aspect of not everybody's going to be happy with whatever policy we come up with. So to Shauna's question, there are some that have been already approved that their rights will not get taken away if they've been officially approved through some kind of a zoning action. There's a couple of those you could probably think of, but there's some other ones that out there that if we decide as a city leadership that that's not necessary to fill the need, then I think it's probably okay to make that difficult to get approval for and to have that extra step, because I think that what the data shows is that there are plenty out there to fill the need. And so it might disappoint some people who are already enjoying that benefit sort of under the radar, if you will. Although they may have registered, they haven't gotten the official approval. So that's my only comment at this point. But as Zach has said, there's certainly a lot of input that we'll take, from here moving forward.
Okay, Richard Keebler.
I'm impressed. I think most of you know that I've spoken to councils several times, being concerned with short-term rentals and what it does, particularly to residential neighborhoods, and most importantly in the neighborhood overlay districts. I think this is a really well thought out and reasonable, and I'm really glad to see it. I think, one of my biggest, the number of days per year, still quite a few, but I'm willing to say, okay, I think the number of contracts makes sense to keep it so there's one person who's ultimately held responsible. I think the occupancy limit is extremely important to keep them from becoming party houses. The underlying district has to rule, because otherwise I think you're raising yourself up to how can you have occupancy limits at all if you're willing to waive them for the short-term rentals? It just would totally destroy that, and would become indefensible, I think, if somebody ever took you to court, on the underlying occupancies, if you're willing to allow more than that. And when you say you know, unrelated. Obviously, if it's grandparents and parents and kids and brothers and sisters, it fits. But if it's a number of different couples, or if it's 8 students coming back for some kind of weekend, it doesn't fit. And I think that's covered here. I think probably trying to make sure it doesn't happen, or to patrol that's going to be kind of tough, but at least it sets a standard. And the requirement for permits makes sense. And then, like you say, you have the conditional use process, and then you can take into consideration, is it on a major thoroughfare? Does it not have? I don't think conditional use should be permitted within the neighborhood overlay districts, but that's something that can be fought later. But conditional uses, like I say, is it on a major thoroughfare? Is it got plenty of parking? There's all kinds of things that can be taken into consideration and should be taken into consideration. So
Okay.
I'm impressed. Thank you for all the work that staff has done on this. And I think this sets reasonable limits without being too restrictive and without creating a burden on everyone to have to get conditional permits.
Okay. Carla?
I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Was there an official report from Dr. Tremblay? Is that who prepared that, or was there something that had like data that I'm missing?
Zach?
There was a report that Dr. Tremblay shared with us, a slideshow of number of graphs and charts and so forth. And that was really where we were able to pull this slide all together from.
Was that in our email and I just missed it?
I don't believe that has been shared.
No.
But we would have that. I mean, it'd be public record. So I don't
Okay, I
imagine.
just wanted to make sure I didn't like miss a report that I should have read.
No, it's about 40 pages. And then I'm sure there's quite a bit more than that is behind that. So Miami University actually purchased the data and kept it on their side of the fence, if you will, and then provided a summary to us kind of as to what we requested. So sort of to keep the privacy away from public records, but also to kind of not burden you with a lot of data too. So, but if you would like to see the slides that they provided, we can do that if you request it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss that part of it in some way. And then I guess I do have some questions. First, the barring of, allowing the barring of sort of this transient, what are we calling it?
Transient guest lodging.
Thank you. The barring of transient guest lodging for only one per building. That seems a little strange because in a way it almost seems like it's unfairly disadvantaging larger buildings. I realize most of those are single ownership, but imagining that you might have, for example, a attached condo complex or something like that, I wonder if there would be a way to make that a proportion versus like a straight limit, because I think that might be that seems a little strange to me. I think we may not have a lot of buildings that are falling into that category right now, but in other places that certainly exists where maybe there would be like a threshold for, or limiting one per building. That just means the first person in, who chooses to do that, gets some sort of priority. And it seems like there may be some potential lawsuit issues related to that. I wonder on that one. And then I had a similar question related to the number of contracts. So it gets a little bit into how you're defining a unit, but you might have a complicated situation with historic homes. I believe I've stayed at a transient guest lodging that was a historic home that was in this type of category where they were leasing individual bedrooms. So it was very much like a hostel. And I don't see that as, it was a good experience. I don't see it as especially problematic. And I guess the question that I have related to this, or something that comes up more broadly in my mind, is just a general question about why is this so much more undesirable than what we already experienced with, for example, student housing in the Mile Square, which seems highly transient. You know, it seems we're almost putting a finer lens on something that, in a way, doesn't seem to be that much more of a nuisance than what we're already dealing with move in, move out, trash on the streets, party houses, just as part of regular business here in Oxford. So I find that just kind of generally interesting, and it kind of makes me wonder if we might be better off taking more of a monetized approach to this, where we're looking at, you know, collection of transient occupancy taxes and looking at financial mechanisms that might be in place that help create pools of money that might help us fund the things that we know we do need, like workforce housing.
It seems to me that if there's a large building and they want to go beyond the by right regulations, then they can ask for an extra use, and then it can come before the hearing. We can look at it and say, hey, is that reasonable in that neighborhood? So it may not be reasonable if we hear from the neighbors around it in every neighborhood, but it might be. And so I think that's where you have the additional use come into play to take care of those situations.
Okay, but I would like a question. So how does this work into our current collection of transient occupancy taxes? And would we look at maybe more of a fiscalized management of this problem?
So we've had a brief conversation with the finance department about this, and their preference is to roll this into a discussion about for the fee ordinance, which is done annually every year. That the council usually reviews that in November. So if there was to be an amendment to the transient lodging tax that's only applicable to hotels at this point, that would happen at the same time. And perhaps Planning Commission and Council would be having passed a transient guest lodging zoning ordinance right before that. So that could be pretty good timing to follow that in sequence. Right now, the state law just has to require 5 rooms or more. So that pretty much makes all of the transient guest lodgings exempt from that. But it allows municipalities to amend that to 1 or more. So then essentially anybody who's doing a transient guest stay will have to pay the tax if we choose to do that as a city.
And my contention would be that we would be in a better position, rather than, for example, setting this like 90-day limit. We would be in a better position to look at how we can use this potential source of revenue, this sort of business opportunity, to generate funds for the things that we do need as a city, rather than to set some of these arbitrary limits. We have a lot of nuisance rentals in our business as usual operations that are over 30-day rentals. And I think the question is, how do we generate funding for productive use in this city? So to me, that sort of, some of these things are kind of getting in the way of what might actually deliver us a better community result. And I think maybe the 90-day limit is part of that for me. I'd rather see us looking at this as an opportunity to generate revenue.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to welcome Corey to the video portion of the meeting. He's been listening and finally got his technical issue taken care of. And did you have a question, Corey?
I do, and this very well could be.
Shauna will be next. Okay, go ahead.
This very well could be just something I missed as I was trying to get technology to cooperate. As I look at the chart in front of us, it has 30 days or greater parking, 2 per dwelling, 2.5 for 3F, and then it says the same for less than 30. Are there any conditions or provisions built in that wouldn't need special consideration from our board or staff for areas. I think of some of the apartments uptown or some of the houses uptown in particular, where there is the parking structure available, or and I can't think of a specific address, but there are parcels in town that maybe don't have a driveway or on property parking that is designated. They may have alley access, or, you know, I'll make this up, they're on University, so they have the street parking. Are those kind of considerations factored in? Because this makes a ton of sense for your traditional residential area, but I can think of a couple pockets where this might be unnecessarily limiting.
Zach?
Yeah, I think I can respond to that. So, so the first part of your question about the parking aspect, and really just for simplifying it, this table doesn't really account for those uptown areas where you have mixed use buildings, and our uptown district actually does not have off-street parking requirements for any residential or any use in buildings in the uptown. However, I think kind of going back to the idea of limiting it to the 1, 2, and 3 family, the idea is that, you know, a lot of our, especially our newer structures uptown that have multiple units in them, far greater than 3 usually, that those would be basically construed as more of a multifamily situation. So the idea is, you know, if you're going to have that many units and those are going to be rented out in a more transient pattern, then you should really be applying for the conditional use to have a hotel, much like the Elms did, or the future annex to the Elms did, where they went through the exact same, you know, conditional use process to have that approved. I think that may address at least part of your question.
So the parcels I was thinking of is, if you know the building that went up on Church Street where Bob Saget used to be. Bob Saget was 3 doors east, I'm sorry,
17
west.
Church.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, that parcel only had access and some parking, which was probably in the alleyway. I just think of on Walnut, there's a lot of houses. So I appreciate the clarification for the uptown zoning. I guess I wasn't thinking of the Chipotle building as much as I was thinking of some of the standalone California bungalows and those houses. So sorry.
Okay, Shauna?
Well, I just, you know, it's great, all the things that Carla said. I mean, these are discussions that I've had in the past about short-term rental, well, transient guest lodgings. I agree with her that this is a really good potential opportunity to put into place some revenue for the city to address, in particular, affordable housing issues. You know, we've been looking for a way to provide revenue for the Housing Trust Fund. We haven't found it yet. And certainly, I know it's not exactly planning purview per se, but it seems to me that having a tax that we can apply to these, you know, this business basically is really going to help the town. And then just as she said, these restrictions, you know, there's really a balance that needs to be there. These are neighborhoods often with houses, with residents like right nearby. So I get that you want to have some restrictions to make the neighborhood more pleasant for everyone, but definitely if we could get some tax revenue for some things that we really need to work on, you know, I would be willing to see that balance get talked about, at least, you know, that some of these restrictions, especially the 90 days, you know, if we were somehow able to get a tax in place, then maybe 90 days is too low a number.
Mark? You got to
I'm not
unmute.
sure if I'm allowed to speak.
Yes, you are. I just called on you. Jason.
So this relates to the point on housing affordability, because I think it's a very important one, and it's something that myself and other researchers are looking at with the data that we have across the country. And one thing that If you completely remove the 90 days, you're opening yourselves up to outside investors coming and buying houses off and taking houses in Oxford off of like the supply. Basically, you're having them remove the supply from the market. If you go back a few slides to, what is it, slide 4, I think. Sorry, slide 2, where we have all the numbers. Right now, the average house in Oxford per month is making $3,800. That covers every single mortgage in town, right? So this is something to think about if you want to open yourselves up to having outsiders come in and buy 10 houses off the market to list on Airbnb, or if you want to prevent that, having a cap on days potentially prevents that or at least limits it. Which is something to think about when it comes to housing affordability. But I agree, as a result, you'll lose less tax revenue. And so this very much is something that you need to think about when you're weighing the benefits and costs.
Thanks, Mark.
On this.
It seems to me you can have a limit of 90 days and you can also have a tax.
Yeah.
Jason, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to ask some of our experts to speak on how these rules in themselves, outside of what we might do going forward in terms of taxing, how these rules in themselves incentivize or disincentivize long-term rentals.
Mark, go ahead.
So you're thinking of long-term rentals that are not to students, I'm guessing, or are you thinking to students as well?
Both, actually, if you could answer that.
So I think it's all about the pricing, right? So it's all about the numbers. If I'm an investor, I think the more so if I'm an investor and I'm considering what to do with not a non-primary residence, and I'm able to rent it out enough to make more than what I would as renting it out to students, then maybe I'm willing to move towards Airbnb. My guess is anyone who's considering this has probably already done that, though, given that the market's been unregulated for as long as it has. So I'm not sure imposing a regulation would make it worse. I think if anything, maybe it could make it better just because right now the market's unregulated. But we should have shown the graph of so we have the pinpoints as to where these Airbnb and HomeAway rentals are. And a lot of them are what we would guess is non-student rentals. They seem to be pretty far away from Miami. And given the percent or the number of days they're being rented, we can suspect that they're primary residents being rented out. So I'm not sure there would be much of an impact in the rental market really at all based on that information.
Okay, thank you. Who else has a comment or a question? Go ahead, Richard.
I just want to point out, in going online and trying to do a little research and looking at what different places are dealing with, there's been an awful lot of publicity out of Sedona, Arizona, and the effect that it's had on affordable housing. And people just can't afford to live there anymore because the investors have come in and bought so many private houses to rent out through Airbnb and VRBO. It's just been unbelievable. And they're trying to grapple with it as to what to do. Essentially what happened was the state came in and removed all restrictions on short-term rentals that individual municipalities had tried to do. And they talk about a lot about the terrible effect on short-term rentals. And I know when we were out there a couple of years ago, talking to a staff when we were on an outing, and they said, well, we can't afford to live here. We have to live 20 miles away. We already have that problem in Oxford. And, with all the new student housing and the students tending to gravitate towards more modern housing, I think we should start to see people who they don't want to let their houses go to pot. They got to do something with them. So let's start to rent them at a more reasonable rate to to people that can afford it. And I think that the more we encourage the short-term rentals in doing that, as I think Mark just said, creates an issue. And the investors, the more people can make, 90 days, if you figure there's really only around 30 weekends a year that people really come in here and the housing's really tight. And 30 that in 3 days, 30 weekends per year, that takes care of all of that and all that issue. So, if they want to turn it into a business, that's fine, but go for the conditional use.
Okay.
Maybe we should have the conditional use for our student rentals then too, because that's definitely a business.
Well, remember that's the neighborhood overlay district were the effort to finally try and stop that, Carla.
Yeah, that's been the mechanism to do that.
Because we couldn't handle, we tried all kinds of other ways to figure it out. And the Housing Advisory Committee is the ones that came up with that as a possible solution, and I think it's helped.
Yeah. Anyone else? Would anybody like to comment for staff on, do you think this is something they should move forward then and get us legislation to actually consider at a future meeting? Or are there areas that you think need to be looked at further? Shauna?
I think this is a very good starting point. I mean, whether it's 90 days or 120 days or whatever, like this framework itself is very good. I agree that regulating it somehow at this point isn't going to make anything worse because it's not been regulated for so long. And definitely I know those, examples here and there where, it doesn't fall under this, but if we're willing to be flexible with how we use the conditional use process, I think this is great. I'd love to see us move forward with this. And once again, I do think that we should have a tax on transient guest lodgings.
Okay. And it does make those people legal too, which is important to remember. Jason, did you have a comment?
Yeah, this makes sense to me, but I know I personally would like some time to really think this over, and I would love if Housing Advisory Committee would get the chance to really think on it too. But this is a great start, and I could definitely see working with this. Just need a little time, maybe.
Well, we're going to have at least a month before anything can happen. Mr. Kennard?
Do you have any data on the number of owner-occupied transient guest lodging homes?
Mark, do you have that? Or Jordan?
So we observe whether it's a full unit or shared, but we do not observe, and we observe multi-listers. So we did have that information. I wish I could think of it off the top of my head. I want to say we had a slide where we had, I think the most was someone had 5.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is that one of the affordable housing theoretical solutions is that there are limits placed on as you know, Mark, probably non-owner occupied rentals versus owner occupied. I think that one of the things that you said was because of the nature of Oxford and with the lack of hotel space, that there is a risk that outside investors will see opportunity there and take more residential housing away from citizens trying to move into the community. And I think that from what my research and ultimately some of the drafts I did on some transient guest lodging, doing owner occupied, and then you also have the registration and you get the inspections, and that's a really significant issue, is that without the registration, you don't get the inspection, which you do on your rentals now, and you don't have the fire extinguishers. You don't have those things that make the staying there safe. So there's lots of reasons to have some regulations in place, and then doing the limitations on. Some communities do it. You can't do it in German Village, for example, in Columbus, which you've already heard. So there's lots of different ways you can accomplish the goals that you want. The courts to date, and this is not in Ohio, but the courts to date that have addressed the situation are leaning towards giving communities great leeway in how transient guest lodging is regulated, because each community is different and has different needs. So I think that there shouldn't be any significant restraint in how you want to regulate it, certainly in the context of discussion. So I've got nothing.
So you don't see any red flags? Chris, you don't see any red flags here legally?
There's some things that I would share with staff. I don't want to do that in a public meeting because of attorney-client situations. Sure. But what I will say is there are always challenges lurking out there to any restrictions on that pertain to how you define who can stay there, particularly in college communities. And there was a case in another jurisdiction that when it was ruled upon, there were some concerns that it might have a trickle-down effect. That has not to date.
Okay, but you can talk with Zach and Sam and work through some of those issues.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Jordan, you had your
Can the members please get a copy of the slideshow?
Yeah, we'll make sure that people get a copy of it. Jordan wanted to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify, it might help answer the last question, just to make a comment. So I pulled up the slide. So there's one host that operates 6 units, 6 individual properties. There's one host that operates 5, one host that operates 4. There's 2 hosts that operate 3, and then 20 hosts that operate 2 units, and then there's 95 single listers, and that's in the Oxford area, not within the city limits. And that's in the slideshow, so that's something you'll have graphically if that's shared.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Seeing none, I think you've got the green light to move forward on the actual legislation, and hopefully we'll see it soon.
Thank you, everyone. It won't be next month because we'll need to have reach out to stakeholders. So that'll be our next step. People that are already registered, and we'll reach out for that input and report back how that's going.
Yeah, we've only been working on it for what, 3 years, so okay. But that's good. We should get the stakeholders involved. So thank you very much for that, Sam. That takes care of our new business. There is a notice of one administrative approval. If you'll remember, commissioners, when we were talking about Gaslight, the development at Gaslight, we all wanted another garbage location, dumpster enclosure, and they were kind of resistant to it. And now they've decided that really they do need that other enclosure that we thought they did. And so they've put it in a reasonable spot, and it was approved administratively. So I thought you'd probably be happy to hear about that. Is there anything else for the commission tonight? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
It's been moved. Thank you, Corey, and seconded by Dick. All those in favor indicate by saying aye or raise your hand. Yeah. All those opposed? Okay, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
See you next
everyone.
month.